Introducing now very gladly our fourth presentation by Marjolein Lanzing, who is Assistant Professor Philosophy of Technology at the University of Amsterdam. She completed her PhD titled The Transparent Self, a normative investigation of changing selves and relationship in the age of the quantified self at the 4TU Center for Ethics and Technology, located in University of Technology Eindhoven. Her research primarily focuses on the ethical implications of digital technologies, privacy, and the impact of technology on personal identity and social relationships. She is involved with the Platform for the Ethics and Politics of Technology, contributing to the interdisciplinary research and discussions on the ethical and political aspects of technological advancements. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Hi. Okay, so I have a question for you. Who would use an algorithm that was developed for making decisions for purposes of security in the field of healthcare? Who would use the exact same algorithm in the field of security for the sphere of healthcare? So I'm going to put it up right here. If you say, sure, I don't see the problem, technology is technology, you can raise your hand. Okay, a few people. Yeah, okay, a few people in the back as well. I'd say 30 careful percentages. And who would say, no, absolutely not? Okay, no. Also careful, but also about 40%. Don't know what that says about the rest, but okay, I think it's a nice estimate. I want to explore your intuitions today about this question, because this question actually is very real today. Okay. I want to introduce Palantir Technologies to you. Who has never heard of Palantir Technologies? Many, many people. And what if I would tell you that it's actually one of the major players and one of the leading tech experts when it comes to artificial intelligence? It's very important. I'll also tell you why you probably haven't heard of it yet. Palantir Technologies is a software company that builds enterprise AI, artificial intelligence for enterprises, data platforms that can be used by organizations that consist of very complex and sensitive data environments. Palantir has currently one of the strongest offerings in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning space. And it has this ambition to create platforms that brings together humans and machines in joint decision-making models. That's their goal. And they do this across a wide space of areas. So they do this to build safer cars and planes, also discovering new drugs, medicine, combating terrorism. This is very important. I will tell you a bit about that in a second. And important to know is that Palantir actually helps customers across the public, across the private, and also non-profit sectors. And they transform, or that's their slogan, the way those parties use their data. Now, essentially, this means that Palantir has access to unprecedented amounts of data and can also offer access to this data. And most importantly, probably, it has the right software, the right tools, the right machine learning to actually navigate these huge data sets. Now, Palantir was actually founded in Silicon Valley by billionaire and close Trump ally Peter Thiel, and is best known for supporting the CIA's counterinsurgency and intelligence operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it has also been involved in border control in the US, well, today it also offers warfare tools to the Israeli forces. Okay. Now, Palantir's contracts with US Homeland Security date back to 2011. So this is also the part that they're most well known for, because it led to a scandal in 2019. So just to rewind a little bit. In 2013, Palantir offered US Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement Palantir Gotham software. Now, these contracts were intended to develop a so-called program called Falcon SA, a technological search and analysis tool for ICE, so the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to detect law violations. Now, under their current contract, Palantir offers all kinds of systems like Falcon to facilitate immigration officials in both discovering targets and then creating and administering cases against them. And in 2019, this was brought to light for the very first time because Palantir operates largely under the radar. When it was criticized for its support for US Immigration and Customs Enforcement's brutal regime of deportations and separation of children from their families at the borders of the US. But there was more. There is one of the key cases involved with ICE was that Palantir provided digital profiling tools to the federal agency as it carried out President Trump's increasingly controversial policies for apprehending and deporting undocumented migrants, including a workplace raid resulting in the arrest of 680 migrant workers in Mississippi on August 7. And this was carried out by an ICE unit that used Palantir software to investigate potential targets and compile evidence against them. Okay. Fast forward a little bit, just a tiny little bit, because in 2020 we all, of course, were part of or suffered from the pandemic. And what we saw was that Palantir, who had been dabbling a little bit in medicine and health alliances with other parties, struck a huge contract with several health institutes, several in the United States. But in Europe, this case also came forward. It was the NHS, the National Health Services in the UK, that actually was going to use Palantir's Foundry platform as part of its COVID-19 responses, including the planning and operational rollout of the UK's vaccine program. Now, Palantir announced it at their website. They said, well, NHS personnel will use Palantir Foundry to understand how COVID-19 is spreading. It will identify risks to particularly vulnerable populations. It will proactively increase health and care resources in emerging hotspots. It will ensure critical equipment, which is supplied to the facilities with the greatest needs, and divert patients and service users to the facilities that are best able to care for them. Now, it sounds fantastic, but under this contract with the NHS, it also became clear that Palantir got access to all of the NHS's health and patient data, and that it's allowed to capitalize on the data of patients in terms of training their AI models and algorithms, so they can build proprietary algorithms. Now, this expansion from originating in one sector and gaining power and wealth and expertise there to another is a phenomena that we see across the board. It doesn't only apply to Palantir, but it applies to many big tech actors that we see. We call this big tech expansionism, right? So the increasing power of big tech, the developers of our digital infrastructures, and what we worry about is that these infrastructures are becoming or are structuring the social domains in which they formerly didn't exist yet. And that through these types of infrastructures, big tech companies can have a very big say in how these domains are actually organized. So you have to think about companies like Meta and Apple and Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, but also Palantir. Now, we see that these companies are expanding from being booksellers in the first place to being healthcare professionals, basically, or venturing out into the fields of health and medicine. First being a search engine, now structuring the fields of education or mobility, even space, humanitarian aid, science. It doesn't end, really. Now, just to give you a bit of an insight on the contracts of Palantir, I mean, it goes from anything related to Air Force to Food and Drug Administration, energy, domestic policing, disease control, prevention, well, you name it, basically, immigration, the army, everywhere. Now, in the EU, we are trying to regulate digital innovation to minimize the risks and harms, of course, of many of these of technologies that are currently being developed. And we have several very ambitious legal frameworks. You know them better than I do. But the GDPR, of course, General Data Protection Regulation, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, now the AI Act. And that's fantastic, of course, that we have those ambitions. But the question is whether we can actually capture the problems that arise in the context or through the lens of sphere transgressions with these types of legal tools. So just to give you a small example, I will zoom in on the GDPR. Because right after Palantir actually got a foothold in Europe and started this contract with the NHS, the major critique was based on data protection. So people said, okay, that's really dangerous. This company actually already has a lot of data, and it will have access to patients' data, and what will it do to patients in that sense? Also given the political history of this company, what will they do with the data, and can we sort of prevent it there? Now, okay, let's talk a bit further, because I think that if you focus only on data protection, in the case of Palantir, but also in cases of Google and Meta and Amazon and so forth, we're starting to miss the mark. And the reason is that these companies have made privacy or data protection their business model. So they're very often GDPR compliant. They will say, we're not looking into personal data. We're not doing anything with that. Of course, they're doing all sorts of things with the data, but data protection itself might miss the mark. So, and even if you don't believe that, you say, okay, these companies still transgress or violate privacy laws. Let's assume that they don't. Let's assume a world in which they don't. Is there still something wrong then with these companies moving into different types of spheres? Who thinks there might still be? Careful, Hans. Okay, Gerald. Yeah, well, I think that intuition is right, and I want to unpack that a little bit. So I want to see if we use a lens of sphere transgressions, and I'll explain in a moment what that actually means, that we will stumble upon risks and harms beyond data protection. Okay. By the way, if you're interested in this, there has been a fantastic paper also that criticizes all of the EU's legislative ambitions from that lens. I will give you the references later on, but I'm just going to focus on the GDPR for now. Okay, just to tie this back to Palantir, now one of its the most or bestseller platforms, Foundry, actually maintains that it supports critical data privacy and security protection. So it will be very hard to use that as a sort of way. Okay, let's see. So let's try to see whether we can reveal risks beyond data protection. And for this, I'm going to use the sphere transgressions framework. This was developed by Marjolein. She's a professor of technology at Radboud University. And she's been working on this for several years, but it's very new, so very experimental. And her question was, like, how should we understand big tech expansionism across these different social spheres? What if Google moves into education? What if it moves into health? And so forth. How should we judge it? And as her theoretical basis, she chose Michael Walzer's Spheres of Justice, which is a book from 1983. I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But in any case, it was an attempt to see whether we could find a new way of judging technologies that transgress the boundaries of social spheres, right? That start out in one sphere, become very powerful in that sphere, and then use that power to move into others. Okay. And then, of course, my task was to find out, like, how should we understand and judge Palantir's move into health, this surveillance company? And could sphere transgressions actually provide a normative tool to do this? Okay. So in the next steps, I want to take you through the spheres of justice and sphere transgressions, then I'll make a reconstruction of the move from Palantir from security into health, and I'll discuss the risks, and I'll end with some notes on law and democracy. Okay. So Michael Walzer, Spheres of Justice, a classic, I think. So in Walzer's book, he tries to set up sort of a theory of justice or just distribution across different types of social spheres. It's a political, philosophical theory, which is, I think very versatile, and it allows for a plurality in society and a plurality of distributions or just distributions within spheres. Now, he distinguishes several spheres: social life, political life, education, the market, security, welfare. Basically, he argues that all these separate spheres in society are constituted by certain social goods. For instance, in the sphere of health, we have the good of medical care, and we distribute that according to logics of care for those in need. So he says these social goods, this care, is distributed according to the principles that are fitting or appropriate with the sphere. With a certain sphere, and that differs, right? It's different in the field of politics, it's different in the sphere of health and medicine. So, okay. Right, now, Tamar Sharon has tried to sort of take this up, because there's a very interesting component to the theory in which Walzer says that, we have these goods from different social spheres. They are distributed according to these different principles of justice. These can be standards or procedures and reasons. However, standards can be violated, goods can be appropriated, and spheres can actually be invaded. After all, he says, there are some goods that are dominant. They are attractive to acquire because whoever owns them actually gains access to other goods. So when an actor or a group of actors succeeds in exploiting the dominance of a certain good or cluster of goods, this is called a monopoly, Walzer says. And the monopolization of goods allows the owners to actually convert those goods into others. So for instance, in a technocratic society, technological knowledge converts to prestige and power, for instance. Now, while this might be contested within spheres, monopolies and dominance are not necessarily unjust as they take place within spheres, right? They are only unjust when power acquired through monopolizing goods in one sphere is actually converted to advantages and power in another. And this is what Walzer calls tyranny. So, for instance, great financial resources obtained in the sphere of money and commodities should not convert to political influence in the sphere of political power. And likewise, political power should not convert to lucrative deals in the market sphere, right? The fact that you are a powerful politician shouldn't mean that you can strike a good deal buying a building or something, or that your children get the very best care as opposed to people who are not in such prestigious political power positions. So according to him, this is considered an invasion of another sphere. All right. Now, Sharon has tried to sort of translate this to the digital era. So she says conversions of advantages based on digital expertise into advantages in other spheres of society are forms of sphere transgressions. And we can actually critique big tech actors for this. So, she worries about the importation and the potential dominance of certain goods and values and practices and logics in such a way that they will actually undermine the values and practices and logics of the spheres, the integrity basically of those spheres, right? So one of her main worries is industrial logic, the values and practices of efficiency and effectiveness and those types of rationales moving into health. So data collection and analysis and infrastructures that might replace, for instance, human care or intentional care and might actually undermine concepts like vulnerability or solidarity and so on. Okay, so the main worry is that big tech will structure our social spheres, leading to changing values and practices across spheres that actually may undermine their meaning. Okay. Now, she also sort of sums this up, the risks in three different ways. She says we have to look out for three different things when we critique big tech expansionism. So non-equitable returns. We have to see whether the actor involved actually gives back to the public. When Palantir, for instance, engages with the NHS, it gets access to all this data of people who gave that voluntarily or it was stored for the public good. But it also has to feed back into society what they're actually doing with this. So it has to be clear. Now, the second one is dominance. So to what extent does actually an actor shape the sphere in which it is involved? In which way is it able to set the agenda, to prioritize its own values and practices, its own logics, its own expertise, as opposed to, for instance, the expertise and values and logics and practices of the sphere it's sort of invaded? And this is something you see a lot, right? So, for instance, in the sphere of health, that tech entrepreneurs will set the agenda, like what is important? Okay, we think Parkinson is important, or longevity, or anti-ageism, and so on. So they set the agenda, and that doesn't involve like a democratic procedure, like arriving at those, or at least a dialogue arriving at those goals. Okay, and then there's new dependencies. So we become heavily dependent, or this is a risk, on the hardware, on the software, on the infrastructures, on the expertise, the wealth, and the data of these types of parties. Now, for a brief reconstruction, how did Palantir actually get into health? Well, of course, there was a crisis going on. So people thought, all right, there's a lot of digital expertise and wealth there, and well, perhaps Palantir can actually help us out in the sphere of health. But there was also something else going on, and I think that's the idea that technology, or at least Palantir's technologies, are neutral. And that's a bit of a, you can unpack the word neutral in many different ways, I guess. But I think that the people who allowed Palantir to work in the health sphere actually thought that technology used for one purpose can also be repurposed easily, without bringing in ideologies, values, or whatsoever. I think they had that in mind. And I think that was also helped by the fact that Palantir uses this. So in there, if you do a discourse analysis of how they talk about their technologies on their website and in the media, public statements, you also see that they mix different repertoires, industrial repertoires that are about innovation and effectiveness, and they mix them up with more democratic or care repertoires like equity and vulnerability and empowerment and so on. So it's sort of, through the language, it also repurposes the technology in a different way. Okay. Now, this creates the illusion, I think, that technologies are neutral, and I take a firm stance in this, on this point. I think they're not, and I will try to argue for it in a second. But I think we have to heed the lessons of Langdon Winner, the theories of Langdon Winner, where he says that technologies are deeply political and should not be isolated from the context in which they were once conceived, designed, developed, and used. It relates to Peter Paul Verbeek's work on how technologies in society mediate each other, they influence each other. And it's very important to be aware of that they also, you cannot really separate the two. So using technologies across social contexts can actually result in structural effects across these types of contexts. And these can be reinforced by the affordances and logics and values of a technology. So if you start a technology in one way and it's imbued with values from that particular context, and you let it travel, or you bring it with you to another, it will have impact on that other sphere or context. Okay. So I think this can actually apply to one of Palantir's platforms, Foundry. So it's a well-known platform. Because it's actually developed it in the sphere of security for security purposes. I think Foundry is an example of being imbued with security values, logics, and politics. And I think that Palantir also plays a key role in putting and keeping these complex technological infrastructures in place. So for instance, when you adopt a Palantir technology, you get an entire team of consultants and Palantir experts with it. It's not just the technology, because you have to learn how to use it. And this also means that you get all these private actors, professionals, basically into, for instance, a health institute, a health context, right? So it's never the technology, it's also always embedded in something, in human interaction and context. Okay, and I think that the neutrality view, which also Palantir supports. So, for instance, when it was faced with critique on ICE, they said, well, you know what, we're just the plumber, we're the messenger. We just built the technology, but if you want to be critical, you have to go to the government because they do the surveillance. We just built the technology, right? So this is also a way of enforcing that. But I think that actually obscures all these logics and politics and values, and it may obscure that technology may actually transport them when it travels across spheres. Okay. Right. I think this is hammering it down a little bit further. I just want to mention that if you have a technology that was built to identify criminals and terrorists, then it should be the subject of intense scrutiny if it becomes subsequently deployed to help the most vulnerable during a health crisis, right? So I think the sphere transgression of Palantir moving into health actually risks harming the logic of the health sphere, and it has to do with the history, with the social context. And I think that the values that are at stake are intentional care, solidarity, vulnerability, and health equity. Now, going back to Sharon's risks, I actually think that they apply very well to the case study. We know that the returns of Palantir into health are, well, minimal at best, if not existent. Of course, they make a lot of profit of the alliance of the contracts with the NHS. For instance, they can train their algorithms and their language models, their machine learning on the data that's there, but there has been no signal yet of what it would mean for the broader public. In terms of dominance, well, we already discussed that. I think that's definitely there. So, yeah, these industrial logics that are taken with it, or these security logics that are taken with it. And then, of course, there are these new dependencies, and I think those are definitely there too. So I think inviting Palantir technology into health actually creates a dependency on its infrastructure, and also on Palantir as an increasingly monopoly provider. There's no public accountability, no public accountability of the company. There's no democratic oversight, and people get easily locked in. And we already know this from examples from domestic policing and Palantir, that once you are sucked into the system, you get continuous updates. You have to learn how to use it again, and at some point, you don't know how to get out of it anymore. Okay. Now, I think that these risks are actually revealed when you put on the sphere transgressions goggles. I do think that it's very important for the sphere transgressions framework, because it doesn't do this itself, to consider the history of technologies and the politics of it, because you would bring it along. So that's something I want to add. I think that already risky expansions might become particularly pernicious when the logics that are imported already prove to be vulnerable to perversion and led to injustice in their sphere of origin. That's when we have to be absolutely stern and super critical. Yeah, what does that mean in terms of law and democracy? I'm not a lawyer, but I worry about this a lot, and I hope this could also be something you could think about. We see that big tech expansionism really is a tension with democratic decision-making. We see that it increasingly shapes our social domains. Peter Thiel has literally said, I've been buying my way into the NHS. There's a big lobby behind this. That we have this big tech power and influence versus this claim of neutrality, while these politics and ideologies are being wheedled in. The skirting of responsibility versus human rights. We're just a plumber, while actually human rights say that corporations have responsibility here to minimize harm. And then, in this particular case, just going back to data protection or privacy is incredibly important. It's still super important, but it's not going to address all of the risks that we also see in these types of cases. Now, I already mentioned that there's a paper that also explains why other European legislations might not going to cut it there. So I want to leave you with some thoughts and some questions to you. As lawyers, as law students, I wonder if this makes any sense to you, but also how would you, or how should we actually protect our social spheres? What legal instruments could actually help us retaining their meaning? If you buy the whole Walzer thing, right? So one suggestion has been that we must be aware that we do not translate the discussion on the risks and harms of technologies always in terms of markets and market fairness, and that we do not reduce the social goods of our spheres to market goods always, because this is a tendency that we have, but that we focus on the just distribution of these goods depending on the principles of each sphere. And of course, it's a challenge. What are those principles? What is appropriate according to those spheres? Who says, right? But I think that would be interesting. So some have suggested focusing on different types of rights, like housing rights, education rights, employment rights, and healthcare rights, and what they would look like if we would update them. And I'm also curious if you would believe in maybe a legal travel ban for some technologies. So that's something left for you. Now, I'm just going to repeat this question. Hold on, here it's again. Who would use an algorithm developed for making decisions about security to make decisions in the context of healthcare? Brave. We can discuss this further, but I'm really curious to hear later from you. All right, thank you.